Snow carried itself through Silver Creek that morning like ghostly ash shaken from an ancient fire. It dusted rooftops, clung to window panes, and muffled the usual sounds of the mountain town. Breath hung heavy in the air, clouds of white drifting upward before quickly vanishing into the pale, cold sky. The streets, lined with frosted storefronts and lampposts crusted in ice, looked abandoned, like a main street caught inside a snow globe that no one had shaken in a long time. Inside the weathered brick of the Silver Creek police station, warmth fought desperately against the icy world outside. Space heaters hummed as if they were part of the department, old and weary. The station smelled of drying wool coats, instant coffee that had been reheated twice, and thick paper files piled across desks. It was another ordinary winter morning, the kind that melted into all the rest, a morning no one expected would be remembered. Deputy Mark Dalton sat at his usual desk near the wide frosted window. He was 38, his build strong but not the kind that intimidated, his back straight even after 15 years on the job. His face carried a quiet authority, with dark brown hair streaked at the edges by early silver, and eyes the color of a storm. Gray, steady, calculating. He was respected in Silver Creek not for being loud or commanding, but for being reliable, the kind of man whose calm words lowered chaos instead of adding to it. While Silver Creek saw him as a steady presence, Mark carried an old chapter of his life like a shadow. Years before, he had worked city precincts as a K9 handler. His closest partner then had been Max, a loyal sable shepherd with the same amber fire in his eyes as the dog fate was about to deliver him this day. Max had saved Mark's life once, pushing him out of harm's way during a collapsing warehouse raid. Losing Max to retirement had created a space in Mark's chest that he had carefully locked away, never quite filling again. The station clicked on with its usual background rhythm. Officer Jim Parker, barely a few years into the force but armed with endless bad jokes, shuffled through forms at the reception desk. Captain Ray Harrington leaned with habitual authority against the coffee counter, wide shoulders squared under his jacket, his salt and pepper beard framing eyes that looked hardly softened by years, still cold steel beneath. Near the far wall, Emily Carter waited, her camera bag slung at her hip. She was 29, a reporter for the Silver Creek Gazette. Wiry, sharp-eyed auburn hair tucked neatly under a knitted gray beanie. She had come for something small, an everyday interview about winter patrols, a filler story for the week's column, yet she already felt the dull boredom of routine creeping into her notes. Mark was about to take another sip of lukewarm coffee and sign the corner of a minor traffic citation when the station doors blasted open. A wedge of white wind and snow roared in, scattering papers on Parker's desk, forcing everyone's heads to turn. Two shapes hurtled through the doorway, not intruders in boots, not townsfolk frozen with frostbite. Dogs. The first was massive, powerful, commanding the room even while dripping mud and ice. Shadow, an older German shepherd, 6 years by rough guess, slid to a halt on the tile. His sable black coat bore streaks of dirt, ice, and something darker, the flecks of snow caught in his fur, sugary white against the grime. His amber eyes locked on Mark, wide with something urgent, fierce. The second followed close behind, his body a younger mirror. Rex, 3 years old, muscles taut, energy wound like wire. His saddle markings were darker than shadows, his eyes darting from face to face, from exit to desk to floor, hyper-alert. He didn't stop moving. He circled, claws clicking on tile, nails scraping as he skid. He lunged forward toward Mark with no hesitation, seizing the hem of Mark's winter uniform jacket with his teeth, tugging sharply, then releasing to dart back toward the door again. His body language shouted plain as speech, "Come with us, now!" The room was frozen. Emily's breath caught. The flash of her camera lit the moment instinctively. Two shepherds standing like apparitions inside the sterile station. They weren't hungry strays searching for scraps. They were soldiers returned from a battlefield with news. Mark rose so suddenly his chair screeched a foot backward across the floor. His voice dropped to a low, even tone, the same tone he'd used years ago soothing nervous K9s before compounds raids. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Shadow stopped dead center in the lobby, paws splayed wide, ribcage rising and dropping fast with exhausted breaths. His tail was stiff, rigid at alert. One long, deep bark ripped free from his chest, deliberate. Not panicked. Rex circled his partner once, then lunged at Mark again, teeth locking briefly on the edge of his coat before jerking loose, running to the door and darting back. The dance of a messenger. It was then Mark noticed it. A slick streak of red smeared across Rex's left paw, shining beneath the pale fluorescence. Not just mud, blood, and on Shadow's hind leg, Where the fur was clotted into a dark crust, he saw a slash wound, old but deep. Mark breathed in sharply, instincts locking into place like they had never left. Two battered, bleeding, clearly trained working dogs had broken into his station together. That was not chance. That was a call. A summons. Captain Harrington's eyes found his, already sharp. A war veteran's gaze. "You see it too," the captain said. No hint of doubt. Mark nodded. "They're leading us." Emily's heart thundered in her chest as she heard it. Her fingers fumbled for her lens, caught between the duty to document history in the making and the ache in her gut, knowing she wasn't just covering a column anymore. She clicked 3 quick shots, the sound punctuating the frozen moment. 2 German shepherds, chests heaving, eyes lit with fiery demand, and the deputy they had chosen staring back down at them. Shadow barked again, louder this time, filling the cement walls like a bell. Rex wound his body in another tight circle, then planted at the snow-dusted door with a cry so raw it flicked across every nerve in the room. Mark straightened, his face dark with certainty. His hand hovered at his belt, not for his firearm, but out of habit, preparation. His mind replayed the streak of blood on paws, the intelligence in their eyes, the tracking posture. He glanced once at Emily, her camera ready, her chin trembling with adrenaline. "This isn't an interruption," Mark said, his voice quiet but bone deep. "This is a cry for help." The cruiser's tires whispered across slush and late snow as Mark steered out of town minutes later, crimson taillights fading against a pale horizon. Emily sat rigid in the passenger seat, her camera pressed against her lap, eyes darting between him and the dogs bounding through the headlights ahead. The town of Silver Creek shrank behind them, street lamps swallowed by fog and growing woods. Before his headlights, Shadow loped steady and deliberate, movements broadcasting trained focus. Rex sprinted ahead, then doubled back, bounding along the line of the road and checking again and again that the deputy's headlights were following. No lost strays ever carried themselves this way. These two were a unit. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened unconsciously. Watching their dark shapes bob in the pale morning reminded him of Max. The way Max had once bolted into danger, but always paused to wait for him, always tethered by trust. His throat tightened. For an instant, it felt less like following 2 unknown dogs, and more like following an echo. Like a familiar pair of amber eyes from his past had returned in other bodies to deliver one final test. Emily, eyes as wide as the lens of her camera, whispered, "I've covered rescue stories before, but I've never seen anything like this." "They're working together," Mark said, voice low. "One leads, one scouts. That's unit training." Snow rumbled under his tires, the paved road slowly giving way to jagged, rutted trail. Pines loomed skeletal at the edges, and branches scraped across the cruiser's roof like black fingers. Their world was falling quieter, darker, the rules of the town giving way to the silence of the mountains. Shadow dropped suddenly to the ground at a curve, nose pressed hard into the ice. He lifted his paw, pressing it down against a dark smear. Mark pulled over, boots crunching across the frozen gravel. Emily trotted after him, hugging her coat closer, camera dangling unused. Up close, Mark crouched, fingers brushing the frozen streak, thick, black, oil, but scattered with beads of red, the tiny droplets of blood that left no doubt. He turned his head to Emily, his voice tightening. "Truck oil, big vehicle, and blood. They're tracking both," Rex barked once, sharp, pulling Mark's attention. The young dog had darted ahead to the bottom of the slope, tail low, pawing frantically at the distance beyond. Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes fixed sharp on Mark. His body was stiff, steady, unwavering. Mark felt it then, that deep, trembling shift in the gut. The old instincts rising from their years of sleep. The feeling before raids, before storms. Not fear, not yet, but the raw alertness of a man about to discover what waits in the silence. Heck clicked his flashlight on and shone it into the tree-line, the beam slicing through drifting snowflakes. A gust of wind blew through the pines, shaking loose powdery snow. Emily brushed strands of hair from her face, lowering her camera to steady her breath. "Do you think someone's hurt?" she asked quietly. Mark glanced at her. "I think something's bad out there, and they're the only reason we're finding it." The path narrowed further, turning into a pair of deep tire ruts now half buried. Shadow advanced slowly, nose tracking the oil spots, his tail rigid. Rex darted ahead to a fallen log, scrambled over, and disappeared behind a bend before reappearing and barking sharply. Mark and Emily exchanged a glance. She slung her camera back over her shoulder. "I'm staying behind you," she said. Mark allowed himself a dry smile. "Good plan." They walked a few more yards, Snow crunching underfoot, breath pluming white in the bitter air. Shadow halted suddenly, hackles lifting along his spine. He emitted a low growl, head angled downhill. Rex echoed the sound, his own ears pinning back. Mark froze. He scanned the shadows between trees, every nerve alive. Emily's hand crept to her camera, but she didn't lift it. The younger shepherd stepped forward, pawing at the edge of the embankment where the trail dipped sharply. Mark edged closer and saw a smear of black rubber marks etched into the snow, a tire track cutting abruptly off the path down toward the ravine. Shadow winded softly, looking back at Mark with a clear plea. Rex pawed harder, small clumps of snow tumbling down. Mark crouched, fingers brushing the gouge. The snow here was churned, branches broken. Something large had gone over the edge. Hess straightened, heartbeat quickening. Truck left the road here, he murmured to Emily. Emily's eyes widened. Then what? Shadow cut her off with a sudden bark. He stepped to the edge, nose stretched toward the drop, tail rigid as a steel rod. Rex trotted back to Mark, nudging his leg with a soft whine, then returned to the edge, glancing back as though to say, "Look." Mark peered over the embankment. Beyond the tangle of pines and the drift of snow, the slope fell away into shadow. He couldn't see the bottom yet, only the line of the tire ruts and broken saplings leading down. He felt a chill unrelated to the wind. This wasn't random. The oil, the blood, the frantic dogs, it was all a trail. He glanced at Emily, who had lifted her camera again, but lowered it, sensing the gravity of the moment. "They're taking us to it," Mark said softly. Shadow's eyes glinted up at him, holding his gaze. Rex barked once, then twice, his voice bouncing off the trees. Mark's jaw tightened. "Okay," he whispered. "We're going down." Snow slid off the branches in soft showers as Deputy Mark Dalton guided Emily Carter down the embankment, boots breaking through crusted ice with each step. The cold here was sharper, wetter, mixed with the tang of oil drifting up from below. Through the scrim of pine needles, the gray truck lay on its side at the bottom of the ravine, steam curling from the crumpled hood. Its back doors had sprung open, one bent upward like a broken wing. A faint chorus of sounds rose to meet them. Whines, scratches, the occasional weak bark threading through the hiss of wind. Shadow moved first, his large body a dark shadow against the snow, claws biting into the slope as he descended. His nose worked in frantic sweeps, head jerking toward the rear of the truck. Rex followed more quickly, sliding down and regaining his footing with the agility of youth, pausing only to glance back at Mark, before bounding forward again. Emily stumbled behind Mark, the camera at her chest bouncing with each step. Her cheeks were raw from the wind, her hazel eyes locked on the twisted vehicle. "This is insane," she muttered, though her hands were already loosening the lens cap, instincts of a reporter overriding her fear. Mark's boots crunched onto the icy ground near the cab. The driver's window had shattered into a lace of frost and glass. Inside slumped a man in his mid-40s, his head tilted against the steering wheel. He was broad-shouldered but gaunt with a long, hollowed face and thinning brown hair plastered with sweat and snow. His jacket, once a clean blue denim, was stained with oil and blood. Mark pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck. A weak pulse fluttered under the skin. "He's alive," Mark said over his shoulder. "Barely." Emily moved closer, zooming in on the scene. "Who is he?" Mark eased the man's wallet from his jacket, reading aloud the name embossed on the driver's license. "John Willis," he murmured. The name stirred no recognition, but a laminated trucking permit slipped free, marking him as an interstate hauler. Shadow emitted a sharp bark at the rear of the truck, claws clattering against the metal bumper. He was up on his hind legs, snout pressed to the gap in the doors, tail low, body rigid with urgency. Rex had darted away from the truck and was now sniffing along the tree line, weaving in and out of undergrowth like a living searchlight. His high-pitched whine carried through the trees as he darted behind a fallen log. Mark unclipped his radio and thumb-med the button. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Dalton. We've got a single vehicle accident, County Road 12, down a ravine." One unconscious driver requesting ambulance and backup static crackled back at him, but faint words bled through, confirming help was on the way. Emily crouched low, snapping frames of shadow at the back doors. "What's in there?" she asked softly. Mark moved toward the rear, boots skidding on a slick patch of ice. The bent doors had peeled away just enough to reveal darkness inside, but through it came the smell of wet fur, urine, and rusted iron. He caught a glimpse of wire mesh and movement, something shifting weakly. Shadow gave a low growl that turned into a soft, high whine. His nose shoved at the gap again, claws digging grooves in the metal. Rex appeared from the trees, carrying a faint yelp in his throat, and trotted back toward Mark, paw pads bleeding slightly from the ice. He nudged Mark's leg and then ran back toward a snow-drifted bush, barking sharply. Mark's flashlight beam skimmed the snow where Rex had been. Tiny paw prints led from the back of the truck into the undergrowth, too small to belong to Shadow or Rex. "There are others out there," Mark said grimly. Emily raised her head from her viewfinder. "Others, dogs," Mark replied, scanning the underbrush. "They've gotten loose." Shadow leaped onto the truck's rear platform, hind claws scraping, and thrust his head deeper into the gap. Inside, Mark could now see more clearly. Rows of battered metal cages stacked too high, blankets shredded, water bowls overturned. In Thetum light, eyes glinted back at him, pairs of terrified eyes behind wire mesh. German shepherds, dozens of them, pressed against the bars, ribs showing under matted coats. Emily gasped, the camera trembling in her hands. "Oh my God," Mark's stomach nodded. This wasn't just an accident. This was a rolling prison. He reached for the back door, trying to force it wider. Rusted hinges groaned but held. "Shadow down," he commanded instinctively, and the older shepherd dropped to his paws, but didn't step away. Gaze locked on the cages. Rex trotted back from the tree-ine, dragging a limp form by the scruff. Another young German shepherd, smaller, its flank scraped raw. He laid it gently at Mark's boots, then sat, whining softly. Emily swallowed hard. "They're finding the ones that escaped," she whispered. Mark knelt, hands steady despite the tremor in his gut. The injured pup blinked up at him with glassy eyes, its breathing shallow but steady. He wrapped his jacket around it and handed it to Emily. "Hold him," he said. "Keep him warm." She cradled the dog, feeling its trembling bones through the cloth, her own eyes blurring. "How many are in there?" she asked. Mark looked past Shadow into the darkness. "Too many." He turned to the cab, checked John Willis for weapons or IDs. In the glove compartment, he found a clipboard with half-completed manifests. No company name, only coded entries, numbers, and initials. This was no licensed transport. Shadow barked again, more insistent this time. Mark grabbed a crowbar from the cruiser, trudged back to the rear doors, and pried at the hinge until it screeched and gave. A wash of ammonia and musk rolled out, Vesmal of confined life. Whimpers rose into the cold air like smoke. Emily held the camera up but lowered it again, shaking her head. "I can't," she murmured. "Not like this." Mark's face was granite. "Document it," he said quietly. "They deserve witnesses." Shadow stepped aside as Mark swung the door open enough to reach inside. A trembling shepherd pressed its nose through the bars, licking his hand. Another barked weakly, tail thumping once before going still. Rex darted off again, disappearing into the snow-swept brush, his voice echoing as he searched for more escapees. Mark pulled at the cages, but they were bolted to the truck's frame. He exhaled, the steam of his breath mixing with the animal's panting. He turned to Emily. "We wait for backup," he said. "Then we get them out." She nodded, clutching the injured pup closer. Shadow leapt back into the truck, moving from cage to cage like a sentry, sniffing each, whining softly as if counting. Mark stood in the snow, radio pressed to his lips again, giving coordinates. Behind him, Rex returned with another limping dog, this one older, grayer, around the muzzle. He dropped it at Mark's feet and wed, tail wagging once in a weary arc. Mark crouched to stroke the animal, his gloves brushing the brittle fur. "Good boy," he murmured to Rex. "Good boy." Emily glanced at him. "They're doing your job for you," she whispered. Mark managed a thin smile. "They're doing more than that. They're saving lives." The scene held. Suspended under the falling snow, the overturned truck, its guttural chorus of trapped animals, the unconscious driver, the two shepherds moving like spirits between cages and tree-ine. Mark's mind catalogued every detail, already planning the rescue, already sensing the larger crime lurking behind this frozen tableau. For now, though, there was only the immediate moment, the living, breathing proof of suffering, and the two battered dogs who'd refused to let it stay hidden. The rear doors of the truck already hung, open, twisted by the crash. Snow blew through the gap in icy gusts, landing on the battered cages stacked inside. The interior was a narrow prison of rust and darkness, packed with German shepherds, whose eyes glowed faintly in the beam of Mark Dalton's flashlight. Their cries were faint whimpers and rasping barks, the sound of creatures too exhausted to even howl. Deputy Mark Dalton pulled himself onto the truck's bent bumper, boots slipping slightly on the slick metal. Shadow, his sable and black frame tense, had already leapt inside, sniffing the rows of cages with a soldier's urgency. His tail was stiff, hackles raised as though every instinct screamed that time was running out. Rex, the younger shepherd, darted between Mark and the trees, nose sweeping the ground, whining sharply when he found the faintest scent of dogs that had scrambled out and hidden in the storm. "God," Emily Carter murmured, her voice muffled by the howl of the wind. She stood at the rear of the truck, her auburn hair plastered to her face, camera hanging useless at her side. Her hazel eyes glistened in the dim light, overwhelmed by the sight inside. "How long have they been trapped like this?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He wedged the crowbar under the first crude padlock and twisted. The brittle metals snapped, clattering into the snow. The cage door swung open, and a shepherd, no more than a year old, crawled forward, ribs sharp under its patchy coat. It collapsed into Mark's lap with a faint whimper. "Too long," he said finally, voice tight. Emily dropped to her knees in the snow, reaching up to take the pup from him. She pressed it to her chest, wrapping her scarf around its trembling body. Her tears streaked hot across her wind-burned cheeks. "They don't even look like dogs anymore," she whispered. "They look like ghosts." Mark moved to the next cage, Shadow beside him. The older dog nosed the latch, pawing impatiently until Mark forced it open. An older shepherd with a graying muzzle limped out, one eye clouded with cataract. He leaned heavily against Shadow as he stepped onto the snow. Shadow licked his muzzle gently, a quiet reassurance. Mark kept working, moving cage by cage, his gloves slick with rust and blood. Each release revealed a new tragedy. A young female with a broken tail, a pyre of adolescent males with raw patches where collars had rubbed their fur away, a tiny pup too weak to stand. Shadow moved with him, coaxing the terrified ones forward, nuzzling their faces until they stumbled out. Outside, Emily had abandoned her camera on the snow. She was kneeling among the freed dogs, pulling them close, whispering to them as if words alone could heal. Some pressed against her legs, desperate for warmth. Others collapsed at her feet, eyes fluttering half shut. A sudden growl ripped from Shadow's throat. He swung his head toward the front of the truck, ears pinned, body rigid. Mark followed his gaze and spotted the danger. A frayed electrical cable sparking against the twisted engine block, each crackle searing bright against the storm. The leaking fuel could ignite at any moment. "Back!" Mark barked. He grabbed Emily by the shoulder, pulling her away from the truck's front. She stumbled but held the pup tight in her arms. Shadow backed away as well, though his eyes never left the sparking cable. His growl deepened, steady, like a warning siren. At that moment, Rex barked frantically from the treeline, his sharp yelps carrying over the storm. Mark squinted through the snow and saw him circling a collapsed pine at the ravine's edge. His body language was urgent, tail stiff, head low, digging at the snow with desperate energy. "Stay here," Mark shouted to Emily. He pushed through knee-deep drifts toward Rex. Behind the tree lay 3 more German shepherds, huddled together in the shallow shelter. One was barely more than a pup, its oversized paws trembling violently. Another was a gangly adolescent, its ribs stark under a matted coat. The third, a mature female with faded tan fur, stood guard over them despite her own trembling body. Her lips curled weakly when Mark approached, a warning growl too soft to frighten. Mark crouched, lowering his flashlight. His voice dropped to the same calm tone he had once used with Max during high-pressure raids. "Easy, girl. You've done your job. Let me help now." The female sniffed his glove, then nudged the pup toward him. Mark scooped the tiny body into his coat, feeling its shallow breaths against his chest. He motioned to the other 2, guiding them out of the hollow. Rex nosed them forward, his whines insistent, tail wagging just enough to encourage. When they reached the truck again, Emily gasped and quickly spread her coat open, taking the pup from Mark. "Oh, baby," she whispered, rocking it against her chest. The older female shepherd pressed her nose against Emily's knee, as though recognizing safety at last. Mark kept working with Shadow until every cage was opened. By the end, the snow around the wreck was alive with dogs of all ages. Some staggered only a few steps before collapsing. Others circled restlessly, their instincts still caught between fear and hope. The older shepherds hovered protectively around the pups, forming small clusters in the storm. Emily was surrounded by them now, her face strewn with tears and snow. She stroked ears, rubbed sides, and whispered into the storm. "You're safe now. You're safe." Shadow stood tall, eyes sweeping the ravine like a sentinel. Rex moved tirelessly between the groups, nudging the weakest, licking muzzles, refusing to let any fall unnoticed. Their roles were clear: Shadow, the calm commander; Rex, the tireless scout. Mark straightened at last, chest heaving. The cages were empty. The prison was broken. Around him, dozens of shepherds filled the ravine with breath and sound. Weak, fragile, but alive. "This wasn't an accident," Emily said. Her voice steady now, her camera back in her hands. "This was deliberate cruelty." Mark met her gaze, his own jaw tight. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Every trembling body around them was evidence enough. Above the faint wail of sirens threaded through the storm. Backup was finally on its way down the mountain road. Relief flickered through Mark's chest, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavier still. Shadow barked once, deep and resonant. Rex answered, tail flicking despite the exhaustion. For the first time since they had stumbled into his station, Mark allowed himself to believe they had saved lives this night. In the howl of the storm, surrounded by freed dogs pressing against him for warmth, he felt hope burning brighter than the sparks still hissing at the wreck. The snowstorm had calmed by the time dawn broke over Silver Creek. The horizon was a sheet of gray and gold, but inside Thesmall County Hospital, the air carried the sterile sting of disinfectant and the soft hum of machines. Deputy Mark Dalton stood near the doorway of a recovery room, arms crossed over his navy jacket, watching the man in the bed stir. John Willis, the truck driver, was pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. In his mid-40s, with hollow cheeks and a wiry frame, he looked like a man whittled down by years of hard work and poor choices. His brown hair was plastered flat, and a purple bruise swelled across his temple where he had struck the steering wheel. His breath rasped as though even the act of inhaling cost him courage. A nurse adjusted the IV drip. She was Nurse Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her early 50s, with kind eyes hidden behind square glasses. Her frame was tall and slender, her salt-streaked hair pulled into a bun. Years of tending to emergencies had given her a calm presence, though her soft voice carried the authority of someone who had seen people at their weakest. She touched John's wrist gently. "You're safe," she told him. "You're in Silver Creek Memorial Hospital. You had an accident, but you made it." John's eyelids fluttered open. His gaze swept across the room until it landed on Mark, standing like a shadow at the end of the bed. Fear flared in his bloodshot eyes. "The dogs," he croaked. "They're alive," Mark said firmly. "Most of them. Some are hurt, but they're being cared for." John swallowed hard, relief wearing with dread. I didn't want any of this." Mark stepped closer, his storm-gray eyes narrowing. "Then tell me what you did want, John. Tell me who made you drive that truck." John squeezed his eyes shut, tears sliding from the corners. His voice was raw when he answered. "They paid me. Said, if I didn't take the load, they'd come after my sister in Denver. I had no choice." He opened his eyes again, desperation clinging to his words. "It's a ring. They smuggle shepherds purebred trained stock, sell them overseas or fight them in pits. I just drove. I never touched them. I swear." Emily Carter, perched in the corner with her notepad, leaned forward. Her auburn hair was tucked behind one ear, her face pale but intent. "Do you have names, places?" John nodded weakly. "Warehouse edge of town, old freight depot off Millstone Road. They said nobody would check there. They keep more there." His breathing quickened, his body trembling. "Please, I only wanted the money. I didn't know they'd treat them like that." Sarah, the nurse, laid a hand on his arm, calming him with practiced tenderness. "Slow down, just breathe." Emily's pen flew across the page. She wasn't just a reporter anymore. She was a witness to the truth unraveling. Her heart pounded with the weight of what she was hearing. Mark's jaw tightened. He had heard enough. "Get some rest, John. But understand this. If you're telling the truth, it's your chance to put an end to this. If you're lying, you'll face every charge I can throw at you." John sagged back into the pillows, eyes closing, exhaustion overtaking fear. Outside the hospital, Emily pulled her coat tighter around her. Her breath fogged in the morning chill as she typed furiously on her laptop from the passenger seat of her SUV. The article poured out of her. Dozens of German shepherds rescued from overturned truck driver claims smuggling ring operating in Silver Creek. She added the photographs she had captured. Shadow barking into the darkness of the truck, Rex nudging a wounded pup, Mark cradling a frail shepherd. The images burned with truth. By afternoon, the Silver Creek Gazette website crashed under the weight of traffic. Bigger outlets picked up the story, and soon regional news stations swarmed the little town. Emily's phone buzzed constantly. Editors from Denver and Salt Lake calling to demand interviews. At the police station, Mark walked through the rows of makeshift kennels. The surviving shepherds had been brought here, lined in crates padded with blankets. Rex, the younger dog, bounded from crate to crate, sniffing noses, wagging his tail, licking the weaker ones until they stirred. The animal control officer, Tom Alvarez, a stocky man in his late 30s with a trimmed beard and calloused hands, watched in awe. "He's got a gift," Tom said. "Most strays would be skittish after all this, but he's calming them down." Mark crouched beside Rex, stroking the younger shepherd's head. "He knows what's at stake," he said softly. Across the station, Shadow had his nose buried in a heap of evidence pulled from the truck. Shredded blankets, a burlap sack with faint traces of meat, and a greasy rag. He stiffened suddenly, ears sharp, and let out a low growl. His nose pressed against the rag again, tail rising like a flag. Mark's instincts parked. "He's got a scent." He followed Shadow as the dog tugged him toward the door, insistent. Shadow's body was taut, his eyes blazing with certainty. He was leading them. Captain Ray Harrington met them in the hallway. "Where's he pulling you?" he asked, his voice growly with fatigue. "Warehouse, if John's telling the truth," Mark replied. Shadow's confirming it. Ray gave a curt nod. Then that's where we'll go. That night, Emily's article aired on the evening broadcast. Families across the county saw the images of weak shepherds pressed against cages, officers cradling them like children, and the two battered strays Shadow and Rex standing as heroes at the heart of it all. The phones at the station lit up with calls, offers to foster, donations of blankets and food, and angry voices demanding justice. Mark stood in the doorway of the kennel room, watching the rows of shepherds sleeping under the soft glow of heat lamps. Rex lay curled against two younger pups, keeping them warm. Shadow sat upright, eyes locked on the evidence table as if his work wasn't finished yet. Mark rubbed a hand across his tired face. The storm had only uncovered the beginning, but thanks to John's confession, Emily's reporting, and the instincts of two extraordinary dogs, the trail now pointed straight to the heart of the smuggling ring. The night pressed heavy over Millstone Road, the snowflakes stinging like tiny shards of glass as they whipped across the empty lot. The old freight depot crouched at the edge of Silver Creek, a rust-streaked skeleton of steel and broken windows. It looked abandoned to anyone passing by. But to Deputy Mark Dalton, standing in the freezing dark with the Shadow and Rex at his side, the place pulsed with menace. The FBI convoy idled nearby, black SUVs, lined like sentinels. Agent Karen Whitfield, a tall, lean woman in her early 40s with a reputation for sharp precision, gave Mark a quick nod. Her blonde hair waisted back and her gloved hands rested lightly on her tactical vest. "Your dogs brought us here," she said in a voice low and firm. "Now let's see what they can do." Mark crouched beside Shadow, the older German shepherd, whose sable coat bristled in the cold. "Find it, boy," he whispered. Shadow sniffed the ground, tail stiff, and then pulled forward with powerful strides. Rex, younger and restless, bounded at his side, ears prick-cricked, nose twitching with every scent the wind carried. The tactical unit moved in silence, rifles cradled, boots crunching over ice. Emily Carter trailed at a distance, her camera slung across her chest. She had promised to stay back, but her instincts as a journalist drove her forward. The auburn-haired reporter's hazel eyes darted from agent to agent, her breath fogging in the cold as she filmed the advance. Inside the warehouse, the air was thicker. The moment the team forced the door open, the stench hit them. Rust, damp straw, and the acrid tang of ammonia. The beam of Mark's flashlight swept across rows of cages, and his stomach clenched. German shepherds, dozens of them, pressed against the bars, their eyes wide with fear. Some were puppies barely old enough to stand. Others were large and powerful, but all bore the marks of neglect. "These aren't random strays," Karen muttered grimly. "They're purebreds. Someone's been making money on rare bloodlines." Her face hardened. "This isn't just cruelty, it's business." Mark's gaze followed Shadow, who had moved past the cages with single-minded focus. The dog's ears twitched as he padded toward the eastern wall, his nose close to the concrete floor. Suddenly he stopped, pawing at a faint seam where the draft whistled through. He barked once, sharp and commanding. Mark knelt, running his glove along the crack. "He's found something." "A hidden exit," Karen signaled 2 agents. They moved forward, checking the wall with careful hands. Behind the seam lay our enforced hatch, cleverly disguised with stacked crates. Shadow growled low, pawing harder, tail rigid like a warning flag. Before Mark could speak, Rex let out a frantic bark from the far end of the warehouse. The younger shepherd had darted toward a corner where a paramedic, Jake Miller, a stocky man in his mid-30s with a warm face, now drained of color, slumped against a wall. His lips were tinged blue, eyes half shut. A hiss whispered from above where a cracked pipe leaked a steady stream of invisible gas. "Gas!" Mark shouted. He sprinted across the floor. A scarf yanked over his mouth and pulled Jake away from the wall. Rex pawed at the man's chest, whining insistently until Jake coughed, eyelids fluttering. Emily's camera shook in her hands as she captured it. Shadow snarling at a hidden exit. Rex saving Amon's life. Mark dragging the paramedic to safety. Her heart hammered. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was proof of a network built on blood and profit, exposed by 2 battered dogs who'd refused to stay silent. Mark pressed his hand firmly against Jake's shoulder. "You're all right. Stay with us." He glanced at Shadow, who still stood guard over the hidden hatch, barking furiously at whatever lay beyond. The warehouse seemed to tremble with the weight of the discovery. The truth was clear now. This wasn't an isolated crime. It was a smuggling ring, one dealing in rare and valuable German shepherds, and thanks to Shadow and Rex, the mask had finally slipped. The warehouse on Millstone Road, now partially lit by floodlights, seemed to breathe with menace. The cages rattled as frightened German shepherds shifted inside, their whines echoing under the steel roof. The gas leak had been contained, and the tactical team secured the perimeter. but tension hung in the air like a taut wire, ready to snap. Mark Dalton adjusted his grip on his sidearm, his storm-gray eyes flicking towards Shadow and Rex. Both dogs were restless, their bodies tuned to something Mark couldn't yet see. Agent Karen Whitfield gave a turn nod to her unit, her blonde hair glinting under the harsh lights. "There are still men inside," she said. "The hatch Shadow found wasn't just a way out. It's a hiding spot." Her voice was steady, but her jaw was tight with impatience. "Let's end this." Mark crouched beside Shadow, the older shepherd's muscles quivering with anticipation. "With me," he whispered. Shadow's amber eyes locked forward, ears stiff. Rex hovered nearby, nose twitching, tail rigid. He barked once, sharp and insistent, before darting toward a stack of crates. The tactical team advanced in 2 columns. Emily Carter, still tucked behind a steel beam with her camera, kept her distance, but didn't dare stop filming. Her breath fogged in front of her lens as she whispered to herself, "Stay alive. Mark, just stay alive." From the shadows near the hidden hatch, movement flared. 2 men bolted out, their boots slapping against the concrete. Both wore dark coats, their faces masked by balaclavas. One carried a pistol, the other a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Drop it!" Karen shouted, her voice slicing the silence. Gunfire cracked in reply. The agents returned fire, the warehouse flashing with muzzle bursts. The armed man sprinted toward the northern exit, but Shadow lunged before Mark could even shout a command. His powerful body slammed into the man's legs, sending him sprawling. The pistol skittered across the concrete as Shadow snarled, teeth bared inches from Themon's throat. The man froze, arms raised, eyes wide with terror. Mark rushed forward, snapping cuffs around the man's wrists. "Not so tough without your gun, huh?" he muttered, hauling him upright. Shadow stepped back but kept his gaze locked on the criminal, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Meanwhile, Rex had disappeared behind the crates. Mark heard his frantic barking echoing sharp and insistent. "What is it, boy?" Mark called, jogging toward the sound. Rex scratched furiously at a stack of tarps covering a hidden alcove. When 2 agents pulled the tarps away, they found another man crouched there, his hands full of papers. He tried to run, but Rex darted behind him, barking until the agents closed in and forced him to the ground. Karen snatched the papers from the floor. Her eyes scanned the pages widening. "This is it," she said, holding up a leather-bound notebook. "Ledgers, contacts, drop points. This is their entire operation." She turned toward Mark, her voice urgent. "This is enough to shut them down statewide." Mark exhaled slowly, adrenaline buzzing in his veins. He looked at Rex, who wagged his tail once, panting happily as though this had all been a game. "Good boy," Mark said, ruffling his ears. Thalos' figure in the room tried to slip through the hatch in the floor, but Mark was faster. He dove, tackling the man hard against the concrete. The balaclava came loose, revealing a scarred face with deep-set eyes. This wasn't just another smuggler. It was the man the entire ring seemed to follow. Victor Kane, mid-50s. Tall, broad-chested, with streaks of gray in his beard and a cruel twist to his lips. He had once run a legitimate kennel, but after bankruptcy, he'd turned his knowledge of dogs into black market empire. "You think you're a hero?" Victor spat, his voice growly. "These dogs are worth more than your badge." Mark pressed his knee into Victor's back, snapping the cuffs tight. "Not tonight," he said flatly. "Tonight you answer for every cage in this place." Emily's camera clicked steadily, capturing every moment. Shadow pinning the gunman, Rex exposing the hidden suspect, and Mark holding the ringleader down with quiet determination. She knew these images would not just tell a story. They would ignite outrage across the country. When the gunfire ceased, silence fell heavy, broken only by the panting of the shepherds in their cages. Agents fanned out, securing the warehouse. Karen approached Mark, her expression softened, if only slightly. "You and your dogs. We wouldn't have found half of this without them." Mark looked at Shadow, sitting tall, chest heaving, and Rex still circling excitedly as though eager for the next task. He reached down, rubbing their heads. "They're not just dogs," he said quietly. "They're partners." The agents carried out the evidence. The notebook, duffel bags stuffed with cash, stacks of forged papers. Each piece was another nail in the coffin of Victor Kane's empire. But the true victory stood on 4 legs, panting in the cold air of a warehouse, finally free from shadows. The courtroom in Silver Creek was packed, a rare sight for the sleepy mountain town. The walls, paneled in dark oak, seemed to lean closer as the trial came to an end. Victor Kane, the scar-faced mastermind of the smuggling ring, sat shackled at the defense table, his cold eyes fixed on the floor as the judge's gavel struck. The sentence was firm, years behind bars with no chance of parole. His empire of cruelty had collapsed overnight. Round him, The other smugglers shifted in their chains, their fates sealed by the evidence ledgers, Cash, and Emily's footage. Among the spectators sat John Willis, thinner now after weeks in custody. His brown hair had gone patchy at the temples, and his clothes hung loosely over his frame. He stood when called, his voice shaking as he admitted guilt, but also recounted the threats that had forced his hand. The court listened, and the judge, though stern, allowed leniency. John's cooperation had exposed the full scope of the ring. He would serve time, yes, but the possibility of parole and rehabilitation remained. For a man who'd once been driven only by fear, it was a fragile thread of hope. The people of Silver Creek followed the case closely, their small town suddenly at the center of national headlines. Emily Carter's articles had lit the fire. She wrote with passion and precision, painting the story not only as a tale of crime and cruelty, but also of courage. Her auburn hair was almost always tucked beneath a wool cap as she ran from interviews to the editing desk. On camera, her hazel eyes glistened as she spoke of Shadow and Rex, the true heroes. She wasn't just reporting anymore. She was giving a voice to the voiceless. The aftermath brought a new rhythm to the town. The rescued German shepherds, nearly 50 in number, were taken to a sprawling animal rescue facility just outside Silver Creek. It was run by Linda Brooks, a middle-aged woman with a soft face, silver-streaked black hair, and the gentle patience of someone who had spent decades nursing broken animals back to life. Linda was tall and willowy, her movements graceful, but her eyes carried a weight of loss. Her husband had been a firefighter, killed in a blaze years ago, and since then she'd poured her heart into giving animals a second chance. Under her care, the dogs thrived. Blankets, toys, and food poured in as donations from across the state. Families lined up to adopt. Children giggled as they knelt to meet the once frightened dogs, coaxing them with treats. Farmers and retirees alike opened their homes. The pups that had shivered in cages now bounded across the snowy yards, tails wagging like banners of freedom. Even the older shepherds, their muzzles graying, found companionship with kind souls who saw beyond scars to the loyalty waiting beneath. Mark Dalton visited often, usually in the quiet of early mornings when the frost still clung to the grass. He would walk the rows of kennels, Shadow padding at his side with a calm dignity, Rex darting back and forth with youthful energy. Mark's storm-gay eyes softened each time a dog pressed against his leg or licked his glove. For him, it wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about healing. One crisp afternoon, the town gathered in the square for a ceremony. The flag whipped in the cold wind, and children sat on their parents' shoulders to see. Captain Ray Harrington spoke first, his growly voice carrying across the crowd. Justice doesn't always come with sirens and guns. Sometimes it comes on four legs. He gestured to Shadow and Rex, who sat proudly by Mark's side. Agent Karen Whitfield stepped forward next. Her usually stern features softened. In her gloved hand, she carried a small medal etched with the words Canine Hero. Sheck knelt, fastening it gently around Shadow's thick neck. The crowd erupted in applause. Shadow sat tall, amber eyes glowing, a low bark rumbling as if he understood. Then it was Rex's turn. A leather collar was placed around his neck, stamped with the title Dog Patrol. He pranced in a circle, tail wagging wildly, licking Mark's hand before bounding up to Emily and planting muddy paws on her coat. The laughter that rippled through the square warmed the frozen air. Mark, his dark hair catching silver in the sunlight, stepped forward to speak. He wasn't a man of many words, but his voice was steady. They came to us broken, but they reminded us what loyalty looks like. From this day forward, they're not just heroes, they're family. His hand rested on both dogs' shoulders, and the crowd cheered again, louder this time. Emily recorded it all, but when she lowered her camera, she couldn't hide the tears in her eyes. Her story had begun as a journalist's assignment. Now it was something more personal, etched into her heart. That evening, as the town dispersed and the square fell quiet under the falling snow, Mark drove out of the rescue shelter. He stood with Shadow and Rex at the edge of the yard, watching as the adopted shepherds stumbled together in play. Snow sprayed into the air as they chased each other, free at last. Families stood nearby, laughing, calling the dogs by their new names. The sight carved itself into Mark's memory. He reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's broad shoulders, then ruffled Rex's ears as the younger dog leaned into him. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the wind. "We did it, boys. We gave them back their lives." Emily joined him, her boots crunching in the snow. She lifted her camera once more, but this time she didn't film. She just stood beside him, letting the moment breathe. The snow fell in gentle silence, cloaking Silver Creek in peace. The scars would take time to fade, but for now, joy reigned. Mark, Shadow, and Rex stood together, a trio bound by fate, watching happiness run wild in the snow. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt the town had found not justice, but hope. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not wrapped in gold or thunder, but in the soft paws of a loyal dog who refuses to give up. Shadow and Rex reminded us that even in a broken world, God still sends guardians in unexpected forms. They could not speak with words, but their courage shouted louder than any human voice. Through them, lives were saved, truth was revealed, and hope was restored to a town that thought miracles had passed it by. In our daily lives, we may not face overturned trucks or hidden crimes, but we all face moments where compassion and courage are needed. The lesson is simple. When you see suffering, do not turn away. Follow the example of these dogs. Stand firm, act with love, and trust that God will guide your steps. If you believe animals are a gift from heaven, and that loyalty itself is a miracle, then share this story with someone you love. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from and write amen if you want God to bless every home with protection, love, and second chances. And if this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, subscribe, and join this channel for more stories of faith, courage, and miracles. May God bless you and your family.